For anyone who doesn't know, there's a controversy brewing between Military Arms Channel and, well, everyone else. There's a lot of ways to look at this stuff, but as a gun policy legal type, it's making me think about just why imported firearms are so catastrophic to deal with and bottlenecked so aggressively that we can even wind up in this type of situation in the first place. So let's talk about importing firearms and just how absolutely manic it is.
While the host of Fuddbusters is a lawyer, he is not your lawyer. If you pay him, maybe, either way you slice it, the video that you are about to watch is not to be construed as legal advice.
We kind of covered a lot of our nation's history of import controls in our episode on 922R, but I think we can do it a little better here. Let's start with some background. We've developed into an economy with comparative advantages in service, logistics, capital goods, chemicals, and intellectual product. We depend primarily on imports for massive sections of our economy. Even here in Florida, we routinely see imported oranges. It's just not something we have an incredible comparative advantage in anymore. Most of the cars you'll see on the highway are imported. Most of my Chevrolet came from Mexico, and a large portion of metals we use in our industry came from overseas. The list goes on. So then, just why is it so absolutely difficult to get an AK, or an SVD, into the country? Let's talk about a little more history. Much of the fracas that led to the American Revolution came as a result of duties and controls on imported goods. You've heard of the Townsend Acts, that fun tea party they threw, all that stuff. But how familiar are you with British gun control immediately before the Revolutionary War? Well, Americans were certainly offended by British controls at this time, but it was more the threat that the Crown might send soldiers to enforce these laws that got Americans boiling. The sentiment was, as the Patriots of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania concluded, in the event of Great Britain attempting to force unjust laws upon us by the strength of arms, our cause we leave to heaven and our rifles. The first response to American shows of force was a recommendation to Governor Gage that he try to disarm the people of the Massachusetts Bay. This was declined as Gage felt it impracticable to accomplish without force. 2 days after the disarmament recommendation, King George blocked the importation of arms and ammunition to America by decree. If you read the decree, of course, it didn't actually ban imports. It simply required a special permission slip. Sound familiar? Of course, these were never granted. So what did the colonists do? Did they fill out the forms and wait patiently for responses from the Royal ATF? Well, no. Benjamin Franklin masterminded the illegal importation of arms and ammunition from the Netherlands, France, and Spain in large numbers. The policy at the core of American resistance to the British was explicitly premised on the right of self-defense, and from that theory, with an inalienable right of self-defense at the core, came our entire conception of the government as the servant and the people as the master. So that's why you go to federal prison for importing guns without permission, and why that's totally constitutionally permissible. Oh, wait. Yeah, let's talk about how we got here in the first place. From the founding to the 20th century, we were generally free to import whatever arms we wanted. After all, our country's foundation lays on the blood of patriots and imported bayonets. Then, of course, we got to the good old Gun Control Act of 1968, which set up the system of FFLs and other licensees we deal with today. One of the things the GCA did was generally prohibit importing firearms that were not particularly suitable or adaptable to sporting purposes. Why? Well, the problem is those darn Europeans kept making really affordable handguns that were massively popular with working-class Americans. The Feds saw working-class Americans affordably arming themselves and said, well, that just won't do. So they targeted these small, cheap handguns. In the discussions prior to the GCA's passage, Congress never even mentioned non-sporting rifles and shotguns. Still today, you can import a shotgun from just about any country, even those weird-looking Turkish ones that vaguely evoke the AR-15. The focus was clearly on handguns and military surplus firearms, with emphasis on the fact that Kennedy had been killed with a Carcano, a rifle surplus by the Italians. So after the GCA's passage, we get this sporting purposes language, and it's kind of just floating out there in the air. So the first thing the feds did to implement it was to develop a test to see whether pistols and revolvers were sporty or not. At this point, they still said nothing about long guns. From then until the mid-80s, I can't even find any evidence of the ATF disqualifying non-surplus rifles or shotguns from importation on the basis of being not sporting. In 1984, though, ATF had a little meltdown about big, funny-looking shotguns, the Street Sweeper and the USAS-12. Yes, there's really no principal difference between these guns and other self-loading shotguns, except that they're silly, have scary names, and are nowhere near as good as an Auto 5. This is often misattributed to the Firearm Owners Protection Act, but it actually came 2 years earlier. So yeah, no, FOPA totally wasn't worth it. So now it's 1989. We've got this great Republican president, the Bush. He's going to stand up for our rights. At this time, freshly made AKs, AUGs, FAMAS, and whatever else were coming into the country without much faff. But this is when the war on drugs was in full swing. Things weren't looking good. You see, drugs had been winning the war on drugs for almost 2 decades now, and despite rampant increases in state-sanctioned violence against drug users, things weren't seeming to turn around. Like with Formula One racing, the government needed excuses as to why it was losing so incredibly badly. It couldn't be that people simply didn't like violent prohibition, kind of like with alcohol. Oh no, had to be something else. Ah, yes! Cheap guns. Obvious answer. You see, law enforcement were complaining that they were outgunned by drug traffickers carrying imported arms. So clearly, this was the problem. At this time, the director of ATF himself estimated that over half of the owners of these imported guns were simply collectors. But no matter. They were pushing Bush hard on doing something about these imported guns. Bush had seemed pretty firm, quoted in February of 1989 as saying he was not about to impose any bans on self-loading weapons. Then, when a drifter used a Norinco Type 56 to kill school children in Stockton, California, the pressure cranked up even more. William Bennett, then Director of National Drug Policy, joined forces with the president's wife to pressure him. Soon later, Bush relented. You see, these guns aren't for hunting, the president was told. These are for the bad guys. Just look at them. It was Bennett, the Director of National Drug Policy, who announced the import ban and ensured it was effective immediately, since import permit applications had tripled. The government gloated that this policy, this exercise of executive power, stopped about 1 million arms from entering the country. Over the next year, the ATF expanded its import ban of semi-automatic rifles, deeming them not at all sporty, citing characteristics of the arms as being common to military firearms, mirroring the language we'd see in contemporary assault weapon bans. Generally, the factors considered in determining whether a rifle is sporting, according to the feds, is whether it's a semi-automatic version of a machine gun, whether it's chambered in an intermediate cartridge, and whether it has any of the now typical assault weapon features. These, of course, including ability to accept a detachable mag larger than 10 rounds, having a foldy or slidey stock, having a second pistol grip, a bayonet lug, because we all know how dangerous bayonets are nowadays, having a flash hider, having a bipod, integral grenade launcher, because we all see surplus grenades lying around, or night sights. So that's what we had to deal with for a while. And you might remember some cool stuff still came in. Overseas companies worked to mangle their guns to fit the new definition, bringing to bear arms like the Norinco Mac-90. Well, this is where things get a little weird. In the early 90s, the Clinton administration began prohibiting the importation of arms and ammunition, except shotguns of course because those are super sporty, from certain countries, notably China and the Soviet Union. That list has now expanded to include a host of sanctioned countries. We also saw the prohibition of importation of arms by certain companies, creating a list that was constantly fiddled with by various administrations. The Russian Federation and countries previously part of the Soviet Union had been listed as specifically prohibited on the ITAR list, and so American businesses could not transact with them. Russia was to be removed from this list in 1995, but everyone was freaking out because if we take them off the list, then nothing's going to stop American companies from, bringing in the new guns from Russia, and they got AKs over there, all right? So Clinton sat down with Russian leadership over some of the fine Federation caviar and hashed out a sort of gentleman's agreement. The only weird thing about this gentleman's agreement is that it affects all of us. Wild, right? It's crazy what you can do with government. It's called the Voluntary Restraint Agreement, and it limited what can come from Russia and the former Soviet states to a very narrow field of arms of ammunition. How does the government have the power to make law with a handshake? Well, they decided they did. They even wrote a memo. They wrote it down. It's fine. Wait, hold on. You might be asking, why punish every single state in the former Soviet Union? After all, it's been dissolved by now for years. To punish the Soviets, of course. What's wrong with you? Anyway, for some times we saw guns coming in still. Remember Saiga? Yeah, that was cool. Then various administrations kept adding European companies to the list of sanctioned entities, with Obama slapping Kalash in 2014 and Trump sealing the deal against Molat in 2017. Many of these sanctions were over Russian action in Ukraine because, after all, the best way to punish a country you're mad at is to cut off supplies to your own people. So that takes us to right now. Let's see about importing, I don't know, SVDs or AK parts kits. You guys love those, right? So first up, we got to get registered in accordance with the Arms Export Control Act. And we got to get ready to apply for an import permit and pay our exorbitant fee. All right. But before we do that, we got to see whether our shipment is going to fly. After all, we've got a limited time window to seal the deal since US import permits expire in an insanely short period of time after they're granted. On top of that, we've got to get an approved export permit from the host country and make sure it stays good long enough that everything is ironed out for when the US grants us a tiny window to bring our stuff in. I mean, we can't deal with messing around here, so we got to be sure. For parts kits, we're going to have to remember that gun parts are treated about the same as guns themselves for import purposes. There's some nuance here, but just because you cut the receiver doesn't mean you get to avoid an import permit. Oh no. You see, playing the import game with the government is kind of like playing any other game with a 4-year-old. You see, the government's making the rules as it goes, and to the government, the game is called, I win, pay me. So let's try to get us some of those things we want, right? We know we want lots of SVDs and AKs. They were made in the former Soviet Union and China, so let's start there. Heck. I mean, we already know they're not going to let us bring in surplus firearms if they're not C&R and sporty. So there goes the majority of SVDs that are sitting out there. But hey, I'm sure a bunch of companies over there will be willing to make us fresh ones. Fresh ones without the bad parts that make it non-sporty, right? Because if it's new and it's sporty, then it's different. Oh, shucks. Looks like it's the policy of the US to deny licenses to import defense articles from certain countries, including China. Of course, defense articles includes most rifles, but not what we'd call ordinary shotguns, because shotguns are eminently sporty. So sporty, they're not even on the munitions list. So we can get Chinese Saiga clones all day, but an NDM-86? No, sir. Not sports. Anyway, moving on. Heck. Says here that any firearm located in or manufactured in any of the Soviet states is a no-go too, unless it's on this highly specific and narrow list. So what does that leave if we want these types of guns or parts? Well, again, we know former Soviet states are a no-go, and that's where most of the AKs and AK derivatives were. But of course, not all the COMBLOC states were part of the Soviet Union proper. Some of them were client states, maintaining a certain amount of autonomy. Obviously, that has a deep-seated relationship to public safety and isn't just an idiot roadblock. So that means we've got to comb Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, the former East Germany, and Hungary for the stuff we want. As long as it was made there, of course. Wait a minute. Are you asking why it's legal to import AK stuff from Romania but not Moldova? Can you shut up? Everyone knows former Soviet AKs are imbued with secret powers that terrify the executive. By now, you see where this is going, I'm sure. The reason the import market, and by extension the AK and SVD market, is so fundamentally broken is because of a smoldering pile of extra-legal executive action which every president for decades has thought only to toss more trash onto the top of. By the way, any president could have reversed this if they cared about the availability of affordable arms, ammunition, and parts. But none of them did. It's because of this mouth-breathing mess that the only option for importing anything like an SVD was with the one country who kind of sort of had the components and toolings to make new ones that could be considered sporty, but also weren't ever technically part of the Soviet Union. So that's the only reason that, in a world as big and hungry to do business as ours, we wound up in a situation where the American market for an entire class of rifle could be hamstrung by a YouTuber. It doesn't make any sense at all. Trade restrictions like this are basically us doing to ourselves what we do to our enemies during wartime, strangling supply lines. If you ask me, I think the founders would have wanted as many SVDs as could conceivably be imported from whoever was willing to sell them. So if you're angry that you can't get an SVD, or that AK kits are cresting thousands of dollars, I think you should be a little more mad at the last 6 or 7 presidents than you are at Tim. If you enjoyed this analysis and are maybe thinking to yourself, boy, I wish more people thought this way, you can help. Share this video or support this work on Patreon. This kind of support will help enable me to make more content more regularly, something I'd really love to be able to do. I've also got some affiliate links to some of the books I recommend for further reading on this topic down in the description. Thank you all so much for watching to the end and for your support. I'll see you next time, or if you become a patron or subscribe star, I'll see you on the Discord. Remember, the anti-side has been working long and hard passing laws, trying to make more. Anything more than minimum compliance is self-regulation. Y'all take care.
Wow.